All right. Good morning, everybody. I'm Phương Nguyễn, and it's my privilege here today to introduce our first plenary sponsored by the Office of Language Assessment, or the OLA, at the University of Chicago. So, just some information about our office. The OLA was established in 2016, and under the leadership of Ahmed Dosen, who's here today too. It has centralized language assessment across campus, overseeing all language test quality and implementation. The OLA has also become a key resource for language assessment expertise, supporting innovative teaching practices across more than 50 languages taught at U Chicago. So, while the work of the OLA is situated in higher education, the University of Chicago has a long history of primary and secondary education. In fact, the university's lab school, serving the needs of learners from pre-K to grade 12, was founded in 1896 by John Dewey. A lot of you know who he is, and he pioneered student-centered learning, which continues to inspire us today, much like the OLA aspires to put learners at the heart of language assessment innovation. So with that, I now introduce our first plenary speaker, Dr. Yuko Butler. She's director of the TESOL programs and a professor in educational linguistics at the University of Pennsylvania. Her research focuses on children's second and foreign language development, as well as language teachers' professional development. She also consults for ETS and for the Center of Applied Linguistics, making her a leading voice in young learners' language assessment. Her talk today, entitled Child-Centered Assessment Concepts, Research and Practice, promises to offer valuable insights into young learners' language assessment. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Butler.
Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for your kind introduction, and it's my great pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for conference organizers and then also University of Chicago. I'm very honored to be here and then have this opportunity to give a talk. So my talk today is about child-centered assessment, concept, research, and practice. So I'm going to talk about children. But there's a lot of issues that I'm going to mention in this talk should be applicable to any learners, regardless of their age. So even if you're not working with young learners at this point, I hope that this presentation is going to be informative for you. So before I am going to proceed, I want to define what we mean by children and young language learners. We don't have agreed upon definitions for young language learners. Depending on the educational context, people define them differently. But in this talk, I'm going to define children learning additional language or languages. So it can be second language or it can be foreign language in an instructional settings. So their age range is something like 5 to 13 years old. So that's the definition of young children and also young language learners in my talk today. So I often ask teachers of young learners, what are you doing? What are you going to do when it comes to assessment? A lot of them said, I'm doing classroom observation. This is very popular and virtually every single teacher says that. And also oral presentations appears to be very, very important. And a show and tell, role plays, and listening test, and portfolio, and self-assessment. These are very popular among young learners. And also, some teachers conduct one-to-one summative assessment. This is the photo that I took by myself. I want you to pay attention to girls' facial expression and then body posture. What makes you feel? I actually feel nervous. This photo makes me nervous as well, and this is the reality, unfortunately. But we're going to talk about the emotion later. This is another photo that I found on the internet. This came from South Korea. So children are taking very high stakes language assessment test. It's interesting to see that the people put colored folders in front of them so that they can cheat with each other. And we often see this kind of a scene everywhere in the world. So does taking assessment really help children learn better? Or don't we make them anxious or nervous? Or are they interested in taking assessments? It's so unfortunate because, learning a foreign language or learning a second language should be fun and exciting. So if you go to a young learner's classroom, and this is a very typical scene, and people get so excited, but why not assessment? I want to ask you a little bit more questions. Have you discussed assessment criteria with your students? Or do children fully understand why they take assessment? Do we know how they feel and what they want from the assessment? Have you designed assessment together with your students? If you haven't done it, here's my suggestion. Let's explore child-centered assessment in our practice and research. So here's the outline today. I'm going to first talk about what we mean by child-centered assessment. And I'm going to share with you 2 lines of research, primarily coming from my own research. But one is a children's language assessment literacy. This is an example of listening to what children say and want. The second one is a self-assessment. This is an example of giving them a greater autonomy. I also want to share with you some practical examples from classrooms. One is making use of their experiences. And second one is inviting students to help pre-service teachers develop assessment. And then followed by conclusion. So this is the outline of my talk today. So first, what we mean by child-centered assessment. Now, the notion of child-centeredness has been around quite some time. This is nothing new. And so there are, multiple conceptualizations and understanding of child-centeredness. First is linked to child-centered education. Just we talked about, child-centered education was originated in the West back in 17th century, if not earlier. And in North America, John Dewey is one of the key players in this camp. So child-centered education emphasizes, freedom to choose or student autonomy, creativity, having a dialogue with a democratic relationship between children and adults. Child-centeredness also has been conceptualized, is rooted in a key article of the United Nations Convention of the Rights of the Child that emphasizes the children's voice and rights, so we need to listen to their voice. Child-centeredness also concerns that children's developmental factors, so they are still developing their cognition, social, emotional aspect, as well as linguistic domains, first language as well as the second language. So we need to really be sensitive about these developmental factors. Now, child-centeredness is also concerned about, the children's lives and experience. It has to be aligned. So material, content, curriculum, and assessment should be rooted in their lives and in experiences. And it should be enjoyable and fun. So when it comes to assessment, it should be success-oriented. And it should benefit children directly. This idea is closely related to the idea of focusing on assessment for learning. So that's child-centeredness. So when we apply this idea to assessment, so in my view, child-centered assessment does not refer to any particular types or methods of assessment per se. It is any approach where the children are invited to participate in the assessment, not merely as a passive object of assessment, but also as social agents. It is also important that children's view and experiences can be directly or indirectly contribute to the improvement of assessment theories, practice, and consequences. And children should benefit from the assessment process by having an opportunity to learn something meaningful. But unfortunately, this idea, child-centeredness, it's not fully exercised in language assessment. Of course, there are some attempts to listen to children. For example, the cognitive validation studies. So here's an example from Poland. So it's English assessment for Polish students, and students are shown this photo and have to choose one of the multiple choice items. So that the teacher has A, long straight hair, B, short curly hair, and C, long curly hair. What is the right answer? Come on, what is the right answer? I heard both B and C. Well, the short curly, this is long curly hair is the intended answer. But it turns out that a lot of children actually chose B, short curly hair. It really turns out that for them, because of the influence from popular culture, animations and films and videos and so forth, long hair for them is something like that, right? But importantly, child-centered assessment should be promoted, in my view, not only because it can improve the validity of the assessment, that's very important, but also because it better meets the needs of young learners. It can help their learning better, and then also they have some more positive experience with assessment. So let's take a look at some research. The first one is a children's language assessment literacy, listening to what children say and want. So what is the language assessment literacy? I don't have to explain to this audience. There are different definitions and conceptualizations. Here's an example of one definition made by Fresher. It's defined as the knowledge, skills, and abilities required to design, develop, maintain, or evaluate large-scale standardized and/or classroom-based tests, familiarity with test processes, and awareness of principles and concepts that guide and underpin practice, including ethics and code of practice. This is quite comprehensive definition. But if you look at different definitions, by and large, they seem to have three major components. One is knowledge, skills, and principles. Now, knowledge refers to stakeholders' understanding of language assessment theories and concepts that include validity and reliabilities and so forth. And skills refers to stakeholders' ability to design, administer, and use assessment. And finally, principles refers to stakeholders' understanding of or actions towards proper use of assessment and consequences in language assessment. And an example includes social impact, fairness, and ethics, and so forth. Now, there's a wealth of research on language assessment literacy, so I'm not going to the detail here, but something related to present talk, some researchers propose that depending on the stakeholders, different language assessment literacy needs to be developed. So here's an example of data, and then she showed 4 ideal language assessment literacy profile for different stakeholders, including classroom teachers. So which one is the classroom teachers one? Any guesses? B, yes, these are B. So if I'm not quite sure you can see them very clearly, but pedagogical knowledge is going to be emphasized in this case. The research also often articulate that teachers do not have sufficient language assessment literacy. And because of that, language assessment literacy needs to be incorporated in teacher professional development. But curiously, learners have been almost neglected in the language assessment literacy until relatively recently. Meg, I'm not quite sure where she is. Yes, Meg is one of the first person to point out these issues in our field. But relatively speaking, we don't talk about language assessment literacy for learners. Some of the cognitive validation research says, so for example, Winkes and her colleagues study based on the young learners' test of English by Cambridge, Michigan language assessment. Their study found that when children had quote-unquote incorrect responses, they often stem from lack of assessment literacy or age-related cognitive limitations, not deficit in English. So that means that the students' lack of assessment literacy can be a serious threat to the assessment validity. Also, if you look at other line of studies which pay attention to their attitude, the students and then teachers' perception towards assessment, these line of studies also often found that there are mismatch between the abilities that the teachers and developers intend to measure and the abilities that the students thought they've been tested. So we need to really understand students' language assessment literacy, especially among young learners. We don't know exactly what they think, what they feel. So listen to their voice. That's what we decided to do in one of our studies. So we had 3 questions, research questions. 1, how do young learners conceptualize assessment? Number 2, what are their views towards assessment designs, procedure, and content? Number 3, how do they perceive the consequence of the test? So these questions roughly correspond to the 3 major elements in language assessment literacy. So knowledge, skills, and principles. Now, this particular study was conducted in Nanjing, China, among 10 4th grade students and 10 6th grade students. After presenting a mock test that was very familiar to the children already, the children were interviewed individually. Now, I have to mention that this study was conducted before the pandemic. So after the pandemic, there are some policy changes. So it's important to address that. To tell you a little bit more about the context of the study, when the study was conducted, the curriculum requirement for English is set relatively low compared with other academic subjects. And this is partially because that the parents spend so much money on children's extracurricular English lessons. And then because of that, the government started seeing a huge disparity among students' English proficiency according to their SES backgrounds. So children's English proficiency level can substantially differ from the target level specified in the curriculum, especially in urban areas. So children in urban areas often take extra lessons outside of the class, so their proficiency level is much higher than the curriculum specified. And then also importantly, assessment are largely form-focused. So let's take a look at the findings. First, knowledge. It's very interesting to see that children already develop a very sophisticated idea about what assessment should look like. So this line of students, this group of students said the assessment should be more learning-oriented. So one child says the school assessments mostly require your rote memorization of the key knowledge points, and it doesn't really help you improve your ability. Another child says the teacher should find out what we have a problem with, and the test should be diagnostic. So another children also addressed the assessment should motivate students. So this particular child concerned that the current assessment at school is boring. And he says, if the test can develop students' interest, this is the girl. If the test can develop students' interest and if it can let students feel that the learning English is fun, then I think that the students can provide something that the teachers can also find interesting. This is kind of interesting to hear that, according to this students' conceptualization, both students and teachers should have fun with the assessment. If the teachers do not find it interesting, then the students cannot find it interesting either. That got me kind of wonder, are we really enjoying the assessment as a teachers? So another students talk about a construct. So this particular child talk about oral assessment should measure students' ability to respond spontaneously. So the student said, in spoken language, you have to say what you're thinking, but in written language, you can think about whether this is appropriate and whether the grammar is correct before writing it down. So oral exam is also about your ability to make immediate response. And in oral expression, if you suddenly forget a word, you have to think of another word immediately. Other children talk about difficult things. That means that construct irrelevant factors, including test-taking strategies. So another child concerning writing assessment and said, most people can easily write 70 to 80 words, but you also need to realize that the more you write, the more likely you're going to make grammar mistakes, and then you lose point. So don't write too much. And then they realize that this is not right. This is not right. They're frustrated with that. Now, when it comes to skill domain, we ask them, if you have any opportunity to design an assessment by yourself, what would you do? And if students could develop assessment, they would develop story-based and meaning-based assessments. Story sounds like very important for them. So this child says, if I would include some stories for reading comprehension. I like science fiction stories and detective stories. So maybe like I have students read a science fiction story, and answer questions, or maybe for writing, I'll give the beginning of a story and then ask students to write the next part of the story. They also prefer to have more open-ended creative assessment. In Chinese composition, they often compare the assessment in their Chinese class, language art class, and an English class. In Chinese composition, you can apply many different aspects onto a certain topic, but English writing is usually limited to a certain topic, so students cannot use their own imagination, but they can only write something shown in the textbook. The teachers are sort of afraid that the students started using some expressions that are not accurate, right? So in an English test, I think we can write about topics that are popular among students and let them express their own opinions. They want to have more authentic and communicative design. This particular students even use the term humanize. These are primary school students. I think that the design of a test should be a little more humanized. When the basic communication is met, there should not be too much attention on the details because the test is meant for using the language. It should not be testing only for the sake of testing. As long as the tester can understand your meaning, it is okay. And children wanted to have assessment that is more accessible to them. This style say, I think the teachers should consult with the students because adults may have different thoughts from children. For example, adults may have more knowledge than children, and sometimes the questions they design may be too difficult for us to understand. Now, finally, when it comes to principles, and we ask them different kinds of issues related to principles, but here about fairness. Okay. So children differ in terms of fairness of the current practice at school. This particular child says the school's assessment is fair because it's aligned with instruction. So alignment between the instruction and assessment is important, even though the difficult level does not match their own proficiency level, which is very interesting. Because now I feel the school pays a lot of attention to grammar, but not to speaking. But if I include too many difficult oral questions, it may be obvious that I put pressure on those students who did not take outside classes. So I think only if the school textbooks has a major change to teach more speaking, then I can include more oral questions. So she thinks it's fair because, at this point, the curriculum set role, the assessment doesn't include oral aspects, so the students who did not have a chance to take English outside of the classroom will not be disadvantaged. Other students think that this is unfair because it doesn't show, the assessment result does not show their own ability. These students also said the difficulty of setting the right level. I feel that the key for designing a test is make the medium level of difficulty, not too easy and not too hard. But I know it will be too much for the teachers to do so. So he already, sympathetic towards the teachers to how difficult it is. So lesson learned, the children know so much about the assessment. They're excited about the idea of developing assessment together with the teachers, even though they have never done it yet. And but of course, there are a lot of individual and regional differences. I must say that this particular study was conducted in a particular context and particular time. So it needs to be contextualized. But what I would like to show here is not exact content of the students said, but the value of listening to students. So what they said helps us practice more child-centered and valid assessment. Now, next one is a self-assessment. So this is an example of giving children greater autonomy. So why is self-assessment attractive? Why a self-assessment attractive from the child-centered point of view? It aligns well with the spirit of child-centered education. So it can focus on students' the autonomous learners and democratic relationship with the teachers and students. Self-assessment also tend to be considered low-stake assessments, so students tend to be less anxious. Self-assessment can be beneficial for formative purposes, so it should promote language learning in principle and also self-regulated learning. And its administration is less contained by its large class sizes or time limitation, right? So compared with, say, one-to-one or oral interview, it's much, efficient, time efficient, and labor efficient. So you started seeing a lot of self-assessment items in textbooks and curriculums and material for teachers, but the self-assessment has not been utilized by teachers as much as the policy expected. And why not? The teacher often say, the student self-assessment really accurate? Especially young learners, we're talking about children. Are they really able to self-assess their own performance? Even experts says children might not be very good at self-assessing their additional language performance. So teachers tend to believe that children's self-assessment is not very accurate and because of their immaturity. They're too young. But if you look at the existing items, here are the items from European language profile. And you see items like this. I can play Simon Says. I can name colors. I can say the alphabet. I can ask where someone lives. And then we often call them language bubble because the students color the bubbles if they think they can do it. But these items are very decontextualized, very abstract. And then in some way, when it comes to CFR-related descriptors, that may be intentional because CFR should be applicable to any context. And then they have descriptors for young learners now. They are developing, but all of the descriptors are something like this, very decontextualized. So what if we contextualize items a little bit more? So instead of asking, I can sing songs well in English, you can ask the children immediately after they involved in activity, say singing ABC song, and I could sing ABC song well in class today. So if you compare the correlations with between decontextualized self-assessment and contextualized assessment with the teacher's assessment and also Cambridge language learners test, you see that correlation or higher for the contextualized self-assessment. And then you can see some developmental effects, but even for fourth grade students, contextualized self-assessment was helpful. So yes, there are some developmental effects, but in addition to that, contextualized self-assessment are less influenced by students' attitudes and personality factors. But why is it so difficult for them to answer the self-assessment items? Now, if you think about the process that they have to go through to respond to self-assessment items, it's quite complicated. So, for example, I can follow short stories. This is coming from Language Bubble as well. In order to respond to this self-assessment item, you need to understand what we mean by follow, right? Follow and understand, these are very popular terms that they use in self-assessments for young learners. But what we mean by follow, and then probably you need to retrieve some examples of short stories. But what we mean by short stories, how short it should be, or only stories that we listen to in class or not. And then how well deserve for can follow. Some stories are more challenging than the others, right? So it is a very complicated process that the children have to go through. So we actually ask the students, after completing a self-assessment items, and use the immediate recall, and then try to understand what kinds of process that they went through. So when it comes to comprehension of the self-assessment items themselves, children's interpretation of commonly used words in self-assessment, such as follow and understand, they had varied interpretation. And then their interpretation may be different from what adults may have assumed. Now, retrieving incidents. Children retrieve different types of incidents depending on items, and children, particularly older ones, often think about incidences that go beyond their own learning experiences. So there are some short stories for adults. I don't understand them, so I won't be able to say yes for this item, and things like that. Now, when it comes to contextualized self-assessment, they focus on the task at hand. So it's easier for them to respond to the items. And reference points also different as well. So this might be something to do with their experience of doing self-assessment. For adults, it's very easy, but for children, it can be very challenging. So we also wonder about, is it lack of their ability or lack of experience that made a challenges for them to answer the self-assessment items? So what if the students have more experience with self-assessments? So the next study that I'm going to show you is an intervention study that I conducted with my colleague and in South Korea. So we had two groups, treatment group and a control group. And then a treatment group, in addition to summative self-assessment, very decontextualized one, and then we have contextualize formative assessment during the semester on a regular basis. Okay, so this is pre-intervention. These are scatter plots showing the relationship between the summative self-assessment and then Cambridge test. All I'm showing here is there's no difference between the treatment group and then control group before the intervention. Now, after the intervention, after one semester, and then you can see the difference between the treatment group and then control group. Interestingly, the students who already have a higher proficiency level, they tend to be better at self-assessing themselves. But it also means that the students who have a relatively lower proficiency, they need more assistance from teachers. Anyway, so far, we mainly concern assessment of learning, meaning accuracy. But can we use self-assessment not just as a measurement tool, but also as an instructional tool? It turns out in the previous study, after one semester intervention, the students in the treatment group ended up learning English more, and then they actually gained more confidence. So regular administration of contextualized self-assessment helped children learn English better and then increase their confidence in English. Other studies also found that the potential merit of the practicing self-assessment, even among young learners, motivation, metacognitive abilities, or self-regulatory abilities. But we have to know that it may take a little bit longer time to see the effects on metacognitive and self-regulatory abilities for children. But still, it's hopeful. Now, here's one example that we found very easy to administer, but it seems to be very effective. That's vocabulary self-assessment items. So in this particular context, the children learned 20 new vocabulary in each unit. And then what we did was randomly select 5 items out of 20 new vocabulary, and then show them like this. And then students are asked to check boxes if they think they understand the meaning of these words. That's it. It took 5 seconds for children to answer this. And then if you have a laptop, if you're a teacher, you can get the result on the spot. It's very easy. But how accurate they are is not the central issue here. We did it for 1 year, and the students in the treatment group learned English vocabulary better, significantly more than in the control group. The mechanism appears to be very simple. The students are very honest. They want to check as many boxes, as many as possible, so they study more. That's it. So this is just one example of using self-assessment as an instructional tool or learning tool. Moreover, instead of having dichotomous items, you can change the items so that you can have a little bit more process-oriented items. So in this case, the children can choose, I can do it already, I'm almost able to do it, or I have not yet, but soon, or I need some help. So you can see that that self-assessment can be a communication tool between the teachers and the students, and help teachers listen to the students' voices more. And it's more process-oriented, so help students to be more autonomous. Now, if you're working with a little bit older children, and they can develop their own rubrics by themselves. So here's the case. There are different entries, like in this case, use of words and expressions. And then there are 3 levels. Now, the phase 2, the middle one, was already filled by the teacher. So students in group looking at the teacher's model, and then have a conversation and negotiation among the group, and then try to come up their own rubric so they can fill in the phase 1 and phase 3 by themselves. So as you can see, that self-assessment can be useful as an instructional tool as well as measurement tool. It can help children develop language, autonomy, and self-regulation and confidence. But there is a word of caution. Self-assessment is not an individual mental activity that is often assumed. It's highly social activity. You need to have a good trust relationship between the teachers and students. And then there's a culture influence as well. So it's quite important to create a safe environment in class for students. And then also you need to have a culture consideration if you're teaching to multicultural, multilingual classrooms. Now I'm aware of the time, so I'm going to quickly talking about two examples from practice. The first one is making use of children's experience and using digital technology. Now, I don't have to tell you, but children use digital technology in life from an early stage in their lives. They are familiar with digital technology, right? Yes, if you go to YouTube, and you can actually see some infants learning how to do toileting by watching the YouTube video. So they are quite familiar with digital technology from very early stage in their lives. So there are some potential benefit of using digital technology in assessment. For teachers, it's easier to monitor individual children's progress, and effective organization assessment of data. Assessment data is possible. I don't have to go through this because I think we're going to listen to digital technology presentations a lot in this conference. When it comes to students, they can have instant feedback from both teachers and potential peers, and it could be self-reflective depending on how you design the assessment, and it can increase motivation and decrease anxiety, and it can be very creative, and then students have fun with it. And of course, the children are already familiar with digital technology, oftentimes more than teachers. So here's an example of e-portfolio. And I thought this is very fascinating way of using the students' digital knowledge in portfolio. So this is a collaboration between art teacher and an English teacher. In the art class, the students draw a self-portrait. And then in an English class, they took a snapshot of their face and then uploaded on Google Art and Culture. This app is going to identify a famous portrait that is the most resembled to you. Isn't that exciting? So in this e-portfolio, as you can see, the students put their own, self-portrait, and then the famous portrait identified by Google, and then they can express whatever they want to. And then it turns out this is such an interesting, fun activity and motivating activity for the students as well, because virtually every single child was curious about who this person is, right? So they try to, look up some information on the internet and using ChatGPT and everything, and then try to identify, try to find out the information about the person and also the museum. And then everybody wants to go to the museum sometime in the future. And then so it's very creative too. And according to the teacher, it's a very interesting activity for to boost up their self-affirmation and self-confidence. And then most children did not know that this is part of the assessment. The e-portfolio was shared by parents and other students, and they got a really positive response. But there are some considerations that we need to have when we use digital technology for children. Of course, there are individual differences in terms of digital skills, so make sure that we're not assessing children's digital skills rather than language skills. And then AI, I'm pretty sure that we're going to hear a lot about AI-related presentation today. But when it comes to children, we have absolutely no idea about the long-term effect of AIs. We started having, some information, particularly from neuroscience, that cognitive strategies And then also interaction styles might be different already. So in other words, when children interact with AI versus interact with humans, their interaction styles appears to be slightly different. But again, it's still very open question. So we need to follow, what's going to happen. And potentially, it could devalue a diversity. So if you use a certain type of pronunciation, certain types of vocabulary or expressions and so forth, eventually, potentially, it can devalue the diversity. So these are the kinds of things that we need to be careful. So use digital technology and assessment wisely when appropriate. Now, the very last one, I'm going to go very quickly. This is another case study on inviting children to help teachers develop assessment. This was conducted as part of the professional development for pre-service teachers in the US. So the project has 4 stages. So pre-service teachers conducted needs analysis based on the information given by the ESOL students. And then they developed assessment, implemented, and then getting feedback from the students. The project is designed in such a way that all 4 stakeholders have some learning experiences through this project. So for the interest of time and then just focusing on children, so benefit for ESL students in this project, they could provide information about their needs to the pre-service teachers. And they took assessment, formative assessment, that was particularly designed for them based on the needs analysis. And then they received very extensive constructive feedback from the pre-service teachers. They love it. They say, well, I love this, the feedback. It's not just, well done, good job. It has a substance, so they love it. They also offered advice or insights to pre-service teachers to improve their assessment. And I don't have a time to go into the detail here, but it was very unique and insightful as well. And then they also receive acknowledgement from the pre-service teachers, and they feel very confident and in being useful and then impactful. So in conclusion, I talked about child-centered assessment. First, what we mean by child-centered assessment, and talk about 2 research the children's language assessment literacy and then self-assessment. And I'm also share with you 2 examples from practice. So child-centered assessment, it needs to be contextualized. It's very, very important. And then we need to have a very flexible approaches. And self-reflection and then having a dialogue with children are very, very critical when we have a child-centered assessment. And that's it. So thank you very much for your attention. Enjoy assessment.
Thank you very much for that, Yuko. And I think we have time for almost 10 minutes of Q&A, till about 5 after. That'll put us 5 minutes behind. Just eat faster during the University of Chicago sponsored ELI snack break, and which is going to be next door, by the way. That's also the room where the posters will be after lunch, posters set up during lunch. Works in progress will be there, and the tech demos will be there. Tech demo people, find me at some point. I'll just tell you, we will be getting about guest accounts on Friday, Saturday for half a dozen of you to get Wi-Fi access, just in case the guest Wi-Fi isn't working. So I'm going to pass the microphones around. Could I have another organizer? Homeland, you're always helpful. So if you have a question, raise your hand. Take one moment.
There we go. Oh, yep, there we go. That was a fantastic presentation. Thank you so much, Dr. Butler. This might just be like a simple clarification question, but when you're doing the self-assessments for these young students, is it in their native language or their target language?
Very good question. The particular study that I mentioned was conducted in South Korea and China. So yes, these are relatively homogeneous in terms of first language backgrounds. So yes, we administer the self-assessment in their first language. Now, if you have multilingual classrooms, this is very challenging. But in principle, it's better to do it in the first language. But of course, it really depends on the student's proficiency level. There are some information from, say, the Scandinavian countries, and even though the English might not be their first language, but some children prefer to use English as well, rather than first language. So again, it really depends on the student. So this is also highlights the importance of having a conversation with children.
Thank you so much.
Anyone else?
Thank you. Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. Very clear, very motivating. I'll start with one last comment about what you said concerning that last question. If we're doing self-assessment for learning purposes, that was one of your points. Probably it has to be in the second language. Am I right?
Not necessary. Right. So it really depends on what the purpose of your self-assessment. So for example, you can use self-assessment to increase their motivation or increase their confidence and so forth. Then it doesn't matter which language you use, right? And then if your primary interest is help them to learn the target language, again, as I mentioned, it really depends on the student's proficiency level. If they're very beginners, it doesn't make any sense to give them the target language. So of course, then you can do translanguaging or use both languages or even multiple languages. Nowadays, then thanks for the AI, it's not that difficult to deal with multilingual self-assessments as well.
And I had a very good question about one of the slides that you showed us, that multiple choice question where they had to choose the type of the hair that the teacher had. You said that because of their culture, they have different ideas about the length of the hair. Do you consider it important to not only teach them the meaning of the word long and short, but also to provide the cultural viewpoint that a second language user, that's an English speaker, for example, in this case, would have about what a short and long hair mean? I mean, are we just teaching them the word long and short, or are we telling them that in English the word long has a slightly different meaning than what you have in your first language?
Well, I'm not quite sure this particular example was something to do with English versus Polish and things like that. This is the differences in conceptualization of long hair versus short hair among children, right? So, of course, an assessment can be a great opportunity for teachers to, talk about intercultural differences in the classroom. And then, so you can even use these items and then say, hey, what do you mean by long hair for you guys? And things like that. And then also assessment is a socialization process, right? It's often not natural for children, right? So children learn to be socialized into the world of, assessment. So if you have to administer a standardized assessment, and then some children got so frustrated because they thought they got the answer right, but they got the wrong mark. Why? So this is an opportunity for them to discuss the cultural differences. I'm not just talking cultural differences. Does not necessarily mean that American culture versus Chinese culture, for example. It's more like a culture in multiple cultures, including children's cultures and then adult cultures as well. Did I answer your question? Thank you.
Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. I have two questions. The first one is, in the first study conducted in China, how did you, what was the basis of your categorization? I just remember a few examples, for instance, humanistic one child said the assessment should be humanistic, and you categorized it under skill. So I think your categories were knowledge, skill, and principle. I thought this could be principle, for instance. So I just wonder how you conceptualized and categorized the data.
Yes, you have a very good point. Sometimes it's not easy to categorize it because the children are not necessarily aware of the three categorization, right? So it has a spontaneous, interview. So yes, you're right that some of the remarks might be overlapping, between the principle and then also procedure. She also talks about, inhuman procedure of standardized assessment that she has to take. So that's part of the reason why we categorize it as a procedure. But you're absolutely right. It also, speaks to the principal issue as well. Yes.
Thank you so much. If I have time, I have a quick second question. I wonder whether you have any examples. I wonder whether you conducted any studies on collected data from students on criteria, developing their own criteria. You gave some suggestions. The instructor could do the first or the middle column in the rubric, and the children could develop the others. The one developed by the teacher is a very long sentence, and I just wondered how different the children's would be. Any studies or data?
Yeah, I translated into English, so that sounds very complicated. But this one was done in their first language. So, and then these students are 6th grade students. So they did not have any difficulty in understanding the teacher's criteria because it was done in first language. Yeah, I should have said that. Thank you for your clarification.
Last question.
Okay, so thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. I would like to hear from you on what advice you would give for the preparation stage. How did you prepare the young learners to make them comfortable enough that they would share information so precisely and so well thought out as they did? Did you get help from their teachers? Did you have a practice session or some kind of warm-up, or how did you build trust so that because I teach adolescents but that are older than these children, so I'm wondering how to approach them in a way that they would feel comfortable enough to share the kind of information you're able to collect from them.
Are you referring to a particular study or in general?
No, I'm talking about this particular study because the feedback that you showed us, the students provided great insights. So
the
how?
very last one.
The last one, yeah.
Okay. Yes, it took for a while for us to have trusted relationship. So this one, there are 4 groups of stakeholders involved in this project. And then we have a long-term relationship with the in-service teacher. And then it takes quite some time for us to have a very trusted relationship. And then the in-service teachers are also aware of, having this opportunity. That's going to be helpful for them and then also their own students as well. So it worked well, but as you suspect, it might not work well all the time. And then it is quite challenging to get into a school district, as everybody knows who would like to work in a school district. And then I think it takes some time to build up the trusted relationship. So we had 3 pilot studies or something beforehand. And then it's ongoing, the pre-service teachers' professional development we have done for a couple of times before. So we learn a lot of things by trying and error. And then, but eventually we can make it a little bit more workable in the end.
Thank you very much. It was a great presentation.